Hi everyone, and a very warm welcome to you all. My name's Leslie Head and I'm the President of the Australian Academy of Humanities. I'd like to acknowledge today the Ngunnawal peoples, traditional custodians of the Canberra region where the Academy is located and where they're hosting today's meeting from. I'm joining you from the traditional lands of the Gadu people in southwestern Victoria. And I also acknowledge the custodians of the lands where located today and pay our respects to their elders past and present. The Academy of Humanities is one of 5 learned academies in Australia, and we collaborate closely with our colleagues in science, technology and engineering, social sciences, and the health and medical sciences. Together, we've formed an organisation, ACOLA, the Australian Council of Learned Academies, to work on major projects for government that require expertise from across a range of disciplines. These address complex challenges such as our advisory work in the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. Through our advisory and public engagement work, we demonstrate the importance of bringing ethical, historical, creative and cultural knowledge and expertise to bear on issues that matter to our communities and our society now and into the future. So as you know, this session is being recorded and will be made available on the Academy's YouTube channel following the event. If you encounter any technical difficulties today, please contact the events team via email, events@humanities.org.au, and you can post all your questions in the chat, and we hope to get to as many as possible. In this President's Conversation, our second for the year, we begin discussion on the themes of citizenship, diaspora and belonging. These themes will be explored in greater depth at our, which you're welcome to join us in Ballarat. These themes, citizenship, diaspora, and an approach through a dominant white settler framing. And this conversation brings together scholars who've sought to unsettle and decolonise this framing by centring more diverse migrant perspectives and relations, often in interaction with Indigenous perspectives. So we'll explore what new understandings of belonging might emerge. Let me introduce all our speakers before I hand over to the first speaker. So we have Dr. Sophie Loy-Wilson, who's a senior lecturer in Australian history at Sydney Uni. She researches the history of Chinese Australian communities in Australia and is currently working on her ARC DECRA, Chinese Business, Economic and Social Survival in White Australia, 1870 to 1940. She leads the history panel at the Museum of Chinese Australia. Dr. Francesco Riccati is Associate Professor of Italian Studies at ANU. He's published extensively on the history of Italian migration to Australia, including his most recent book, Italians in Australia, History, Memory, Identity. His most recent research focuses on migration and ethnic history. Dr. Ruth D'Souza is RMIT University Vice-Chancellor's Fellow based in the School of Art. In nursing, Ruth is a highly experienced multidisciplinary educator, researcher and consultant, specialising in cultural safety, racism and birth, and the potential role of digital technologies in health equity. Her beautiful garden and her delicious lunches are very famous on Twitter. So if she wasn't here, she'd probably be eating her lunch for us and we'd all be drooling. And last but not least, Ian Paradis is a Wakaya man and chair in race relations at Deakin University. He conducts research on the health, social and economic effects of racism, anti-racism theory, policy and practice, as well as Indigenous knowledges and decolonisation. Ian is an anarchist ecological activist committed to interrupting the devastating impacts of modern societies. So I hope you'll agree, a fantastically expert panel, and I'll hand over. For those who haven't joined us before, the format is that each presenter will present for 6 minutes maximum. We'll then have some conversation within the panel, audience questions. So just reminding the audience, you're welcome to put questions in the chat whenever you like. Sometimes the speaker can reply in the chat or we'll pick up questions at the end. So over to you, Sophie.
Thank you so much for coming, everyone. Thank you so much, Leslie. It's a real honour to be here today to speak with Leslie, Francesco, Ruth and Yin. I'll just make sure I'm all set up here. Wujari Gamarua. I acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians of the country I am talking to you from today. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to all First Nations people here today. My name is Sophie Loy-Wilson, and I'm an Australian historian. I study the history of Chinese Australian communities in this country. Some 40,000 Chinese migrants arrived in Australia after 1850, making them the most significant non-Indigenous ethnic group here after Europeans. But few written records remain to document their lives. Their impact, though, is still all around us, in the remnants of Chinese market gardens marking the old boundaries of towns and cities, in buildings and temples, graves and memorials, such as the one you see here, and importantly, in the many, many Chinese Australian descendants in our community, including Chinese Indigenous communities. Textual records, though, are pretty thin on the ground. This brings me to the first point I want to make today. History telling in our society is like our democracy, aspirational. It aspires to be equal and fair, but of course, in practice, it is not. This is because the documents we base our history on have not come down to us in equal representative ways. This is especially the case in settler colonial societies such as Australia, where history has been largely written by white colonizers and where national collections, such as national archives, are largely made up of English language documents written by those colonizers. In my fields, in a bid to assert a Chinese Australian perspective, historians have turned to oral history, historians such as the author of this book here, Mavis Gokyan, who in the 1980s and 1990s conducted over 40 hours of interviews with Chinese Australians. Mavis and all but one of her interviewees have now passed away. This book was published posthumously. Until the second half of the 20th century, the only types of sources generally considered by historians to be acceptable and usable were exclusively written documents. Oral history emerged as a response to existing silences in the archive, a way of capturing the perspectives of people and subjects otherwise absent in written documentation. So it's a deeply political thing to do, oral history. In 2020, Mavis's collection of Chinese Australian oral histories was rediscovered by her daughter and son-in-law, Richard and Sharman Horsberg, and published as South Flows the Pearl, the book you see here. I think that part of what made Mavis's Chinese Australian history so good is that she captured the whole span of her subject's life experience. She interviewed men and women who came of age in the 1930s and 1940s, who knew the landscape of interwar Australia as well as they did Republican-era China. These are men and women that had moved between the two places. Some were Chinese-Irish, some Chinese-Danish, some Chinese Indigenous. They understood what it was like to work on a Chinese market garden in Manly or a Chinese shop in Perth, to cook in a Chinese kitchen in Haymarket or sweat on a sugarcane plantation in Queensland. But equally, they understood how to gather fuel for the fire in a village in South China, or how to run a small temple in a fishing village outside Macau, or how to fight in the Chinese Civil War. This really is Australian history in a Chinese context. And it's no small thing. In fact, it's quite a radical way of looking at history, especially Australian history. As historians, we are taught to take all the messiness of history and place it in neat linear timeframes like the ones you see here, so that we can begin to understand it all, to make sense of the past. But where are Chinese Australians in these stories? The men and women that Mavis interviewed lived lives that bridged two countries, China and Australia. Their lives were tied not to events in Europe or America, but to events in Asia. Their lives were as affected by the timeline on the left as the timeline on the right. The dates we choose to elevate in history matter. And the choice is a very powerful one. It sends a message. Think about the 26th of January, for example. So this is my second and final point. History writing in Australia has been traditionally Anglo-centric, concerned more with events in Europe and America than with events in Asia, or with the long history of Indigenous Australia. All this is changing, of course, but it is changing slowly. Today, I can count 6 descendants of Chinese Australians I work with, young people proudly reclaiming their history through Chinese language sources and family oral histories. I'm proud to know them. If we are to have a more inclusive, diverse society, we need a more inclusive, diverse history. How we tell the story matters. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Sophie. Fantastic introduction for us. We're going to move directly on to our second speaker. So introducing Francesco. Welcome, Francesco.
Thank you. Just going to share the screen. Okay. So thank you, Leslie. I'm humbled by the opportunity to be here with you all today, discussing this important issue. I would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people as the owners of the unceded land on which I live and work, and pay my respect to their elders past and present. I am a scholar of Mediterranean and Italian migration to Australia, and in these few minutes, I'd like to provide 2 examples of the kind of transcultural connections that historians may discover if they are ready to center Indigenous sovereignty in their work on migration and ethnic history. These are positive examples, but I don't use them to hide or deny the complicity of Mediterranean migrants in settler colonialism. Greek and Italian migrants in particular have played a key role in settler colonialism. Many were and are racist, and at a structural level, their racial ambiguity and their whitening over time have been functional to the settler colonial project. Yet, it is also true that many migrants have developed deep, complex, and creative forms of transcultural connections, friendship, love, commerce, labor, and solidarity with Indigenous people, and these are important histories that deserve to be told. In the first example, Kim Drakopoulos recalls growing up Greek in a cattle station in Tijikala, Central Australia in the 1960s. He told his story to Maria Pallotta Chiarolli for her project Mobs and Wogs, and Maria and I have co-authored an article on Kim's memories, recently published in the Journal of Intercultural Studies. And this is how Kim recalls playing and communicating with other kids. I spoke many languages. My Aboriginal friends came from 3 different tribes, Arrente, Luricha, and Pijinjarra. So I spoke a combination of all those languages. And I spoke Greek with Dad, and with Mom spoke English. 2 other friends spoke mostly German with a bit of Greek. No one could really understand anything we said because we spoke Greek, German, English, Arrente, Pijinjarra, and Luricha. So it's just what comes naturally after growing up in that area. We kids, we could understand each other, but no one could understand us. The second example is from a series of short interviews that Vincent Lamberti filmed in 2013 in the Lakes area of East Gippsland. 2 Indigenous elders and 1 Italian migrant recalled the relations between post-war Italian migrants and Indigenous people in the area. So the first one is Laniers. The Italians, they'd been very friendly with the Blacks. We had very close connections to them because they was Italian, they was different to the white man. We sort of grew together and they looked after for us in a good way, and we never forgot them. They just got richer and richer, though we still stay friends today and they still look out for us. And they haven't changed one bit. They're always there's always a good day and how are ya? And that's what family is all about, you know. And the second is Aileen Gordon. Mainly, we was working for the Italians. It was easy to get jobs from them. They was in the same situation we were, I reckon. We got on well with Italians. I think they are like us. Race is not going to go away. You know, the Italians, they get code names, the Greeks too, and we get code names, except the white man. And finally, Dominic Berlingeri, the Italian one. In my shop, I had a lot to do with Indigenous people, which I found beautiful and really lovely people to deal with. We had a soft spot for them because we felt people didn't treat them as good as they should. Some of the Aboriginal called me brother. I felt I was a brother to them, you know. So there is a complex history of transcultural and multilingual relations between non-Anglo migrants and First Nations people, a history that, with a few exceptions, remains largely overlooked and could instead provide important lessons on how transcultural solidarity and resistance can develop between racialized migrants and First Nations people. In order for this kind of history to develop, we need to ensure that two key approaches are implemented. First, migrant and ethnic histories must finally be taken seriously within Australian historiography. And second, all migrant and ethnic histories in this country must deal explicitly with and be informed by First Nations sovereignty. When we do this, we start discovering memories and stories that have not been sufficiently acknowledged, even though they are central to the lives of many ethnic and Indigenous families and communities. In the process, we may finally recognize that Indigenous, settler, colonial, and migration histories are, in fact, deeply and inextricably intertwined. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesco. Really fascinating. And handing straight over to Ruth.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to do this sharing of screen as well. It's a real honor to be here today with you and part of this important conversation. My thanks to the organizers, fellow panelists, and the many friends that have joined us. Want to acknowledge the time and space that we're in as well, where we're trying to create these intimate bonds through technology, even while we face very unknown futures. For those who don't know me, I'm an uninvited guest on the land of the Kulin Nations, and I'd really like to acknowledge all First Nations people tuning in. My own history, and it's really wonderful the way in which we've started this conversation, talking about stories and histories, and I'm going to talk a little bit about history before I talk about the present moment. My own history is as a displaced Goan between several continents. Goa was a Portuguese colony in India. It's a history that's been interrupted and radically reformulated by European imperialism, comprising Portuguese colonialism and its collusions with British and German colonialities. I moved from Tanzania and Kenya, which were Black post-colonizing societies, to the settler colonial society of Aotearoa and then Australia, entering as an Asian person and other due to the racial logics of British Empire in both settler colonies where Asians were othered and abjected. So here I am in Australia, occupying the dual position of having had my traditional lands colonized, but my subsequent migrations implicate me in the settler colonial project. So multiculturalism is an administrative response to difference and a technocratic attempt to fashion nationalist discourses into liberal benevolence. It's the activism of other people of color, and we've been hearing about them, people who've been racialized as people of color, which allowed white dominant nations to see the need for white settler societies. I'm a bit nervous. I'm kind of going, and I'm not used to speaking for 5 minutes as well. So I'm trying to be kind of deeply intellectual and witty, but I'll do the best I can, folks. I should have had some pictures of food and that would have calmed me down. So where was I? It's the activism of other people of color which allowed white dominant nations to see the need for white settler societies to adopt policies of cultural recognition. My work in birthing and perinatal mental health nursing has involved trying to understand how systems that support mothers/birthing parents and babies continue to be racist and resist change. I started a podcast called Birthing and Justice during lockdown as part of my fellowship in the School of Art. In the podcast, I brought together diverse voices, and I'm thinking very much of the work that Sophie and Francesco have shared with us. Brought together diverse voices who identify as mothers, who have a relationship to culture that is considered different to colonial natality. I've invited them to give voice to this expertise in the public domain within a broader history of activism in order to contribute to building coalitions and community across difference. My goal is to change the system of birthing, which is othering. In bringing them together, I hope to enable a collective recognition of the shared but different experiences connecting them with each other into the public sphere. Conversations between First Nations people in all settler colonies and people of colour in all these sovereign territories has allowed me to take what I've known theoretically, that is, the Māori nursing discourse of cultural safety is relevant to me. In centering the voices of Indigenous and people of colour, I have found points of resonance of my own experience in two different parts of empire and how Australia is similar to Aotearoa. I love that the podcast centres the lived experiences of First Nations and people of colour as they negotiate their social and political identities as other mothers or parents. I love that I can use media and technology as a form of resistance, as an alternative knowledge site, and as a space that honours and cares for life in a way that healthcare services often do not. I love that the podcast is creating a community across physical and spatio-temporal boundaries. But this is my provocation. I want to see a world where I'm not the person that convenes all the voices. These voices should be everywhere. And if our media and other institutions were doing a good job, we would not need the podcast.
Thanks very much, Ruth. Very interesting provocation. So moving on now to Yin. Over to you, Yin.
Okay, thank you, Leslie. I'd like to start by acknowledging my brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nations, and honour Bunjil, the great ancestor creator of country that I am on. So just a brief whirlwind tour of citizenship, diaspora and belonging. Citizenship, meaning inhabitant of a city or town from the 1300s. Cities are very problematic places. As Sophie Strand put it, cities are all about shipping shit out and never having to deal with cycles of decay. They suck in resources and they create waste. They always have. COVID saw record numbers leaving Australian cities, largest quarterly loss on record. I think we're witnessing beyond COVID, a beginning of the end for cities and the nation states which have hijacked the term citizen for themselves. Diaspora means to scatter across, the etymology of the word. Modern migration and diaspora are imperatives largely of colonial and neoliberal labour circulation, human capital and nationalist population expansion. Such modes of movement are profoundly fracturing for humans, human communities, and human sense of belonging, which we're getting to soon. Of course, people have always travelled for becoming, exchange, trade, and the sheer joy and the audacity of it. However, much more slowly at human scale, in a circulating wave-like manner of sacred departure and return. For example, this is a map of trade routes and storylines between Aboriginal tribal groups in Australia before colonisation. There's a lot happening here. There's a lot of movement, there's a lot of travel, but it's different to modern forms of migration and diaspora. Belonging, of course, from the mid-14th century means to go along with or properly relate to. That's very important. We talk a lot in Indigenous perspectives about proper relationships. Question is, can we foster societies wherein our indicates belonging, not ownership, in which our longing to belong is met, and where belonging is not simply going along, but encompasses forms of relational autonomy? belonging as embodied, incarnate, haptic, visceral, immediate, and unmediated, incorporating cathartic ritual intensity, where we ask, what can we do together, authentically, as actual bodies in real life, rather than who agrees with me and shares my views on Facebook or Instagram or LinkedIn. This is a big ask, and the barriers to belonging, the belonging that we need, are things like a sense of separation from land, other beings, and each other, a sense of superiority, a denial of entanglement with the world, human-centeredness, notions of merit and innocence, denial of systemic violence and complicity in harm produced by modernity, notions of linear progress and the possibility of continuity of the system that we have, denial of the limits of the planet that we are attempting to kill. We won't, but we're trying. Certainty, mastery, and control, offering simplistic technical solutions to intractable problems that deny the magnitude of collective challenges that we face. Those are big barriers, a mix of epistemological, ontological, moral, the nature of reality, the nature of the way we see reality, and the way we do ethics and morality. So to radically relocalize is one method of more Indigenous decolonial approaches to belonging. That would involve volunteering, mentoring, skill sharing, time banking, donating, sharing, connecting, and basically participating in mutual aid networks, cooperatives, and commons where you live right now. Sustenance, healing, caring, entertaining through participation and creation and creativity. We would need to relinquish debt, money, private property, but not personal possessions, and hierarchical oppressive organizations, which I call institutions, which include nation states, which are really institutions of institutions. We could, if we wished, reject competitive success, stop being consumptive spectators in our own lives, and live wildly in conscious, frugal, simple, sufficient, joyful pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Yin, for that provocation and a great kind of overview. So many questions and themes here. I'm going to start by directing a question to each participant in order, and then we're going to the panel. We'll ask a question of one other member of the panel, and then we'll move to questions from the floor. So again, a reminder, feel free to put your questions in the chat. So Sophie, to start with you, thank you for your really interesting remarks there. Again, touching on some really big questions, but picking up on your point about invisibility and making things visible. And you started to make some comments about the way we'd see Australian history differently if all was free and fair. But can you elaborate a bit? What specific parts of the Australian story do you think we would envision with the kind of material that you're excavating, particularly from the oral histories of Chinese?
Yeah, what's really struck me, Leslie, in the research that I've done, is that when you move the scale in Australian history, so when you move beyond, say, the national scale and you look at communities, for example, Lawn Hill in North Queensland, where the site of the memorial to the Chinese Indigenous couple, Arbo and Opal, that I showed at the beginning, when you move the scale and you go down and look at community level, the intricacies of our history are clear for all to see. The ways in which our history is multilingual, multi-ethnic, and was always like this. The ways in which ties across communities were maintained and negotiated in really careful ways and in very difficult circumstances in the face of settler colonial violence and in the face of the racism of the White Australia policy, for example. What I think is interesting is when you move the scale up and you go back to the national story, we find it hard in the national story to capture that complexity, to capture the ways in which there are multiple histories of globalization, frankly, in our communities. There are histories that Francesco, Ruth, and Yin talked about as well. So what I'm finding is that the history is all there at community level. Incredible volunteers in local historical societies, amazing local history collections, underfunded, of course, incredible local histories, amazing historical societies. For example, the Chinese Australian Historical Society, very active in Sydney, where I live. What I'm curious about is why, when, for example, we talk politically about our history, it's hard for us to incorporate that diversity of perspective in the national story. And I think that says something about, you know, how political our history is and the national framing. And I don't think that the way that we tell the national story, and I'm talking particularly here about the way politicians maybe tell our national story, the way that our prime ministers have funded our national story via things like the War Memorial, for example, via things like huge investments from the Howard government into the history of the Anzac legend. I don't think the funding or political representation of our national history does justice to the incredible complexity and beautiful cross-cultural relationships in local communities. And what I'm finding is that increasingly local communities are kind of claiming that complexity in interesting ways. And what I'm hoping is that that translates to a higher scale of communication.
Oh, great. Thank you. So you've and Francesco, I wanted to pick up on this with you because you talk about this in quite a lot of detail, this amazingly rich linguistic skills of various communities. Can you say a bit more about anything interesting to do with that? It's just so fascinating and so ignored, isn't it? In big picture, English, monocultural, monolingual story.
Yes. Well, I think part of the problem is that there are, you know, thousands, many, maybe millions of these kind of stories and this kind of different ways of translanguaging and bringing together different languages and cultures and identities and experiences. But as Sophie was saying, they rarely become part of the national narrative, but also, of course, they don't become, you know, hegemonic. So if you think of that example with all that mixing of languages, which worked very well in that particular context, but, you know, the Kim says, you know, we could understand each other, but no one could understand us. That, in a sense, is, you know, the summary for me of so much of Australian history, you know, that when people and communities and individuals talk, they understand each other. But then at the broader national level, as Sophie was saying, there seems to be this inability to communicate. And I think that's where, you know, this kind of research that try to explore this myriads of small, important story at the level of the body, if you want, as Ian was saying, you know, at the level of actual, real contact and interactions between people really matters. And I think there is a structural issue there as well. You know, how can we find the resources and the time to really explore these stories? It's a big question for me.
Yeah, thank you. Some beautiful word pictures in there. And I don't know if Joe Lobianco is in the audience, but if he is, Joe, you might have something to say about this discussion. So Ruth, thank you for your beautiful provocation. I'm going to kind of pick up on a slightly different point, and the fact that the focus here is birthing. So I'm wondering if part of the issue is also mothering as other. Are all these issues more difficult because we still treat mothers as in various aspects of our community life?
Yeah, I mean, where to even start? But I think there are also differences between mothers and what kinds of mothering are supported and nurtured and encouraged. And in my own work, I've been really interested in pro-natalist and anti with an I natalist policies, you know, historically, and Sophie and Francesco will know more about that than I do, but you know, particular kinds of mothers have been valorized, whether they're the upper middle class or the European, particularly amidst fears of race suicide in the colonies. And I think, you know, traces of those attitudes remain with us. I've just spent the weekend with maternal and child health nurses and family health nurses, and you know, what we believe about how people should raise children is central to the formation of the nation. You know, like the children are our future nation, and so there's a lot of investment in how they're surveilled and managed, how mothers or birthing parents are treated, what kind of resources are made available. And I think the ground is not even for those people. And also, I kind of think the people that care for mothers or birthing parents are similarly not valued. So, you know, I thought of the expertise in this massive lecture theatre full of nurses who were all of my vintage, which is not exactly young, and how unattractive a field it is for young people, you know, to do both their registered nursing and then do their midwifery and then do further education in family health nursing. So I kind of think that the whole field's a bit of a mess, to be honest. And the voices of those who are made marginal need to be centered. And I guess that's what I'm trying to do, is to kind of provoke in a feeling way, in a way that none of my writing has, which is why I'm trying sound and listening and asynchronous kind of mode, to see if there are ways we can change how people think, widen the conversation, you know. So I know that people are using them in their teaching, which really excites me, and in their own kind of advocacy efforts. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer.
No, well, all these answers raise we communicate these ideas, I think, is really interesting as well. But let me go on to and pick up on the point you made about cities and the fact that you see cities as I can't remember the exact words, but in decline or on the way out. I'm interested to hear more about this, because we often are told that cities are the future in a world where we have to live as humans more densely and cut ourselves off from nature in order to protect nature somewhere out there. Can you elaborate on the future of cities?
Yes, well, we're often told a lot of things, like, for instance, capitalism is the future. That's a good one. I've heard that one around a few times. Cities are the future, coloniality is the future, nation states are the future, and so on. Obviously, the point is that it's all bullshit. You don't protect nature by pretending there is such a thing as wilderness. There's no such thing as wilderness. Humans have always interacted with their environment. And we have mostly done so for 95% of our history in a way that was synergistic, it was harmonic, that was win-win for our species and many other species. We can be a custodial species. We're not a keystone species, like wolves in Yellowstone. Nobody needs us. If we died out, no other species would suffer, except for domestic animals. But we can be a custodial species. We can add. That's why the idea of wilderness is very dangerous, because it suggests that humans, and many development projects have involved removing Indigenous peoples from areas to protect them. That doesn't protect them. It makes things worse. So we need to be part of our country. That means we need to live sparsely, not densely, where we can see, we can perceive, where we can notice the impacts of our lives. In cities, we outsource the impacts of our lives and we insource resources. We have no capacity to connect with the impacts of our ways of life. We have no ability to close loops, the loops that meet our needs. That's why cities are an integral part of colonial capitalist patriarchy. And like the modern system that we live in, which is dying. We're in late stage modernity now. Cities are on the way out.
Okay, great. And a lot of questions we could take up there, but I'm going to hand over to the panelists now. Let me just check my notes. So first, I'm going to call on Francesco to ask a question of Ruth or make a comment.
Well, it's very hard to ask a question to Ruth because I have so many questions. I experienced, having a child, and my wife and I in Australia, and the sense of just isolation and incomprehensibility of the whole thing was just incredible. And to me, maybe something not politically correct, but something that was really apparent to me and my wife was the alterity of the Anglo-white culture that seemed to shape every form of support there, as if, we could link to a lot of other migrants and children of migrants and so on, and find solidarity and help and food. But every time we tried through the institutional channels, we'll find this Anglo-white culture that was really different, I guess, from what we were experiencing. So maybe, I don't know, a comment on that. I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but maybe Ruth can add something to this.
Congratulations. I mean, I think, having a child in a new country is an epitome of the new life. It's the absolute materialization of the new life. And I think what I've struggled with in my own practice, so I started working on a postnatal ward in 1994, sorry, which is where all these questions started to really provoke me and make me frustrated. And it was just the idea of the hospital or health services as factories, which were predicated on pushing as many people through as possible with maybe a slight tweak to account for difference, but not really kind of tuning into the significance of this new life and what it means to people who are separated from family. And in my own research, what I found is that more collective ways of making family and supporting each other are deeply pathologized in this kind of very neoliberal way of being a parent, neoliberalized, which is about the right products, doing the right things, but really with a very intensive kind of burden on the birthing parent. And there's not a lot of resourcing and space within institutions to allow for more collective, more joyful, more loving kind of ways of bringing a child into the world. And I really struggled with that. I just saw how health professionals kind of made this experience of, I'm thinking, Francesco, your child embodies all your hopes for this new life in Australia, and for that not to be celebrated, just makes me very sad. So I saw a lot of that around me, and I think that's what I'm trying to address in this podcast is a way of saying, can we even just open our minds to other ways of thinking about this universal experience that's felt so differently in different bodies?
Thanks, Ruth. Would you like to go on, Ruth, to ask your question to Yin?
This is a very spontaneous kind of system we've got going here. Thinking on our feet, Leslie, and I'm just thinking I shouldn't have had that.
I've got the time in mind. We can get more spontaneous as we go.
Yeah, awesome. But I shouldn't have had that pasta just before this conversation. But Yin, I'm kind of curious about, and maybe it's a more personal question, how your work considers racism in this. You described yourself as I think it was anarchist ecological activist, which I really love. and just what threads you see connecting with your previous anti-racism work or current anti-racism work. How are you kind of connecting these bits of work, very important work that you're doing?
Yes, good question. I'll just leave my video off for a sec because I'm having some connectivity issues. Look, you know, racism is a symptom of colonization, basically, patriarchy and colonization. And so I've kind of moved on to considering decolonization and Indigenous perspective as a broader framework in which racism is embedded, and all of the same hierarchical forms of thinking, judgment and comparison and coercion and condemnation, which are foundational to racism, are a part and parcel of the broader sphere of patriarchal colonialism. So looking at the disease, not the symptom, is how I would characterize it.
Thanks, Yin. And would you like to talk to Sophie, please?
Sure. I'm really interested in the way that Chinese migrants have been invisibilized in Australian history by and large. I myself have actually been to Lawn Hill, which few people have, and seen the old remains of Chinese market gardens and so forth. I'm wondering what do you think has changed to make a somewhat more authorizing environment to even acknowledge Chinese ancestry? I also have Chinese ancestry myself, Indigenous and Chinese. So what is it that's changed, and how is this the contours of receptivity for you know, people who don't appear Chinese but have Chinese ancestry in Australia?
Oh, wow, Yin, it was so moving for me to hear that you've been to Lawn Hill. And a really great question, and one that I also find quite emotional. Look, from what I can see, the moment in which the woman I spoke about, Mavis, was working, the late 80s and early 90s, purported to be this time of reclaiming or, you know, reviving a multicultural Australia. I'd make the point that Mavis found it impossible to publish her book at that point. She couldn't publish it, despite, you know, incredible stories emerging, such as the story of Sam and Opal Arbau. In that book, she couldn't find an interest. She was told that her book wasn't commercially viable, wasn't academic enough. I have a theory in response to your question. From what I can tell in the field that I work in, there are some very active descendants, Chinese, Indigenous, Australian descendants, you know, like I said, Chinese Irish, Chinese Danish, and the advent of family history, as my colleague Tanya Evans has said at Macquarie University, has a radical potential. So the combination of access to more technology, access to the internet, combined with a political consciousness among some descendants around the injustice that many of their ancestors experienced, combined with louder conversations about Indigenous sovereignty and dispossession, combined with, you know, some grudging, you know, movement on the part of the government towards acknowledging these histories. That's what I think is allowing for these conversations to finally happen. But, you know, they're not happening enough. I'll just reiterate one more point. I mark a lot of PhD theses, it's one of my jobs. The amount of theses I'm now marking by the, you know, descendants of Chinese Australians is really remarkable. They're often turning to family history and family collections in order to do this. Sometimes they're getting documents that have never been translated by translators such as Ely Finch, a famous translator of historic Cantonese documents in Australia. This is all happening right now, and I think it's partly about a political consciousness. It's partly about a new generation of really politically active descendants challenging the story. And it's, also, I think, partly about, a kind of pride in family history that's finally being allowed to emerge.
And Sophie, you can talk to Francesco to wrap up this circle.
Francesco, I loved your paper. I love the way that it, highlighted, some of the incredible history that's being done in this country. I was going to ask you, why do you think that the dominant national historical narrative in Australia, the kind of hegemonic narrative, if you like, is so resistant to the multilingual and multi-ethnic stories that you and your colleague Maria have uncovered?
That's a big question. Well, I think obviously there are issues with, the racism and colonialism and the structure of Australian society, which clearly don't facilitate, the recognition of multilingual and transcultural connections. The other problem I think there is a problem with the way multiculturalism has been conceptualized in Australia. It's a way that continue to center the Anglo, component of society and treat each community as separate entities at the sort of the appendix of society. And so it's relatively easier to do Italian migration history, Chinese migration history, and so on. I think it is much harder to do history that really go across, different communities and intersect with Indigenous people, because I think that's the kind of history that really challenge or you could say bypass that centrality of white Anglo-Australia, that find new ways of solidarity, of survival, of resistance, of reimagining, of that I think are powerful, but are constantly marginalized, not only by the assimilationist white, racist structure of Australian society, but also by a certain kind of multiculturalism that always bring ethnic community back to a stereotypical, essentialized understanding of them, rather than really exploring how within a racist country, these communities, these individuals, these families have found solidarity across different languages, different cultures, different ethnicity, and so on. And I think that's where we really need to kind of insist that we need a different kind of more transcultural and multi-ethnic history.
Thanks, Francesco. So your comments relate to a question that is in the Q&A, and I'm sorry, audience, I've just been reminded that the audience can't see all the questions. So I'm going to repeat some of the questions and ask particular panelists to comment on them. So again, a reminder, if you do have something you'd like the panelists to discuss further, please put it in the Q&A. We've got half an hour now for that broader discussion, so plenty of time. So our first one comes from Joe Lobianco. And I think he doesn't have audio, so he probably can't jump in himself. But and for those who don't know, Joe's the curator of our symposium in November. So he's listening with first he says congrats to the speakers. He'd like to ask research between migrant and Indigenous researchers we could promote to intensify the perspectives that you've discussed. So Sophie, I know you've started to answer this question, but perhaps you could have a go at Joe's question.
Sure. Just briefly, Joe is part of my extended family, and has been a close family friend to myself and my best friend, Kate. So talking about community and diaspora and belonging, and talking about, the kind of role of technology that both Ruth and Yin have alluded to, I think that's a really interesting kind of coincidence. I loved your question, Joe, because I think it gets to kind of the structural issue of all of this. I suppose when I speak about structures, I mean the kind of different institutions that define exclusion or inclusion, citizenship, diaspora in our country. Okay, in my fields, this is a really, really big question. There hasn't been that much cooperation between Chinese Australian historians, at least, and Indigenous communities, although we have seen from the comments that Yin made and also the oral history record, there are these very large communities of Chinese Indigenous Australians. So I think three things need to happen. And one of them's the boring but obvious answer: serious government funding for Chinese Indigenous communities to preserve their history. I can name 7 communities in regional Australia that want to do this work, don't have the money, don't have the time, don't have the expertise. Doing history takes labor, time, and money. It's a privilege, not enough funding. The second thing that needs to happen is, and hasn't happened yet in this country, is a real reckoning with the history of anti-Chinese violence in Australia's past. Hasn't happened yet. It's very, very painful history. The Chinese Australian community is calling for an apology for that history. It's happened in America, it's happened in Canada, it's happened in New Zealand, hasn't happened in Australia. That needs to happen. The third thing that needs to happen is some theorizing, I think, and thinking around the ways in which Chinese communities themselves were settlers and complicit in Indigenous dispossession. That's also kind of happening within, communities, but I think it needs to happen. And it is happening in the wonderful work of scholars such as Francesco, who, along with my colleague Andonis, Pipaglo, have done amazing work theorizing the ways in which non-Anglo migrant communities relate to this question of Indigenous dispossession. So that's my sort of long, intense answer, sorry.
Fantastic, thank you.
Oh, Joe, you are there. Do you want to respond?
No, I just really appreciate it. I hope you can hear me. Really appreciated Sophie's very succinct and excellent answer. I really hope that we get this kind of debate going at the symposium. It's so rare to do this. In addition to the points that Sophie made, I think there's just no, although it is implicit in one of her points, there's no, unless individuals within universities who are always involved in very competitive funding grant relationships, unless they construct the big problem issue and apply for funding, and then they have to persuade people through the ARC and other funding channels to stretch the categories that they already have rigidly fixed, it's always going to be hit and miss. So I agree with Sophie's point that there's got to be some central targeting of the need to do this research. I'm not a historian, but I do think there's also a resistance within the history profession, which I've had this experience directly, but not professionally as a historian, but in asking them to account for the differentiation of the non-Indigenous populations in Australia. And I find that there's really very little appetite for them to do this, and they dismiss ethnic histories as some kind of side note to everything else. But as a lot of people have said today, it's actually very illuminating. This is the lived life of multiple thousands and thousands of people, or more than that. So I think it's a really important contribution to the kind of learning that everyone has to do about the society that we inhabit with a lot of injustice. So there's got to be some central direction to do this better. And it's not coming from the museums. I don't see it coming from, I could be wrong about these things because I'm not a professional historian, but I don't see it coming from the museums. I don't see it coming from the professional historical associations, and I don't see it coming from the funding bodies. So it's got to be made as a case to government to recognise that these are not completely silent parts of our national story, but they're certainly not very well known. And when they're revealed, like, some of the comments that were made before, I grew up in a small country town, which was an agricultural town, tobacco farming, share farmers from South Italy. And all of this tobacco was established originally by Chinese people who had been displaced from these areas. And I went to school with, they had also established the hops that was also cultivated around the area. As agricultural communities and kids growing up on the same farms, none of us had any sense of the really complex, multi-generational modes in which migration was attached to the almost blanket exclusion of the original inhabitants of that area, and then our own histories written on top of this. And it's still not written up, except in the most superficial ways, but fascinating both in terms of the ecological maintenance of these really beautiful areas and the economic livelihoods of the populations that eked out for 150 years almost their lives there. So I feel that these collaborations need to be supported more substantially by central sources so that they can really happen. I hope that's a coherent thing to say.
Thanks, Joe. Really interesting comments. If there's any historians in the audience who'd like to respond, please do so in the Q&A and I'll read it out. Let me go to a question from Andonis Piparoglu. And Yin, I think I'll throw this one to you. I would love if some of you could discuss how pervasive terms like settler, migrant, ethnic, and of course Indigenous circulate and or are contested in your respective local worlds. Thanks again. And thanks for the talks. Andonis said.
Yes, I'll give a very quick answer to that, which is a lot of time is spent on terminology, semantics, you could say, and yeah, people spend a lot of time. What is a settler? What is a migrant? What does ethnic mean? Should we say called? Should we not say called? Should we say Indigenous? Should we say Aboriginal? And or it's mostly a waste of time, and much time is wasted on it. Identity politics is not where we're at. We're at decolonising. That's the basic orientation of our society, how it works. This window dressing stuff is very much welcomed by the powers that be, the capitalist, colonial, patriarchal powers that be, because it has no impact on their power whatsoever.
Thanks, Yin. And can I ask a follow-up question, which was really provoked by your talk? Obviously, if we proceeded to follow your various suggestions, universities would be very different institutions. Maybe they wouldn't exist at all. But what do you see? What does it look like, the future of academic work? What should it look like?
Yes, quick answer to that. That's correct. Universities wouldn't exist, and that's a great thing. Human learning should happen in situ. It's cultural, it's social, it's embedded in everyday life. That's how it's done for 97% of our history as humans, and that's how it will be done in the future.
Okay, thank you. Now we've got an anonymous question. Ruth, I think I'll throw this one to you to start with. How important do you think popular culture is, like music, literature, art, TV, film, fashion, its funding, circulation, visibility, accessibility, and creation, including on social media, informing the diversity of the national story? What are the connections between study and storytelling?
Oh, such a great question, because there's so many ways I think that question could be answered, but one of the things that came to my mind was whether these things actually fundamentally change the kind of structural barriers that are present for people being able to live whole, flourishing lives. And I kind of worry sometimes that incorporation into the national story is this sort of consumptive, it's this consumptive multiculturalism that benefits dominant cultures, but not really people who live in those worlds. Sorry, I feel terribly inarticulate today, but I think it's the combination of time pressure and Zooming. But the other part, I think, like why I've been so keen on the podcast, and as I sort of feel like it's a vehicle for enlisting allies and advocates, And I'm thinking about Yin's response to that previous question. I kind of feel like people used to have to go to university to learn the vocabulary, the jargon, and now so much of it is accessible through social media. Like I kind of feel like the people I engage with on social media really help with my thinking and provoking new ways of understanding the world. And I'm really grateful for that. What I'm hoping through my podcast, and I keep getting feedback about it, is that people who might not have access to the intimacy of the kinds of conversations that happen on a podcast where Indigenous guests and people of color are centered, get a glimpse into another way of thinking, being, and doing, and maybe open up to it. So an example is my neighbor who's doing earthworks across the road. I don't often tell people that I work in this racism space, but I did, and I told her about the podcast. And then she came to me in tears like a week later, having listened to the podcast, and she said, the interview that you did with a Somali mother really resonated for me, even though I had my child 40 years ago, because 40 years ago, my mother and my grandmother died before my firstborn was born at home. And I had 2 weeks off work, and then I'm able to just be in a community of people in the way the Somali doula was encouraging members of her community. If I could have just been somewhere where they said, come as you are and we will nourish you, it would have changed my life. So I guess that popular culture and national stories can be informed by sharing particular stories rather than so-called universal stories. And I feel now that my neighbor's someone who, like I could never imagine that she'd be able to relate to a younger Somali woman. And it excites me that storytelling can do this. And I know that Sophie and Francesco, this is the kind of work space that you've been in, feeling that profound empathy. But I don't know if empathy then can change structures and systems that, marginalized groups. And that's a question I'm really interested in.
Thanks, Ruth. You're sounding very articulate to us, so don't worry about that. Here's a comment rather than a question, but Francesco, I might ask you to respond to this. It's from Moreno Giovannoni. In the Italian community I grew up in, some people believe that the Australian Indigenous people were a raza finita, a finished race. The Italians also believed that they had come to a country that was available for the taking for anyone with a desire to work. They had no awareness of the Indigenous people having been here for tens of thousands of years. Is that a widespread perception, do you think, Francesco?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and the other thing to consider is that, of course, Italians, when they came to Australia, they also carried their own racist ideologies, right? That's not just, it's not just Australia. Of course, colonialism, capitalism, patriarchy, they're everywhere. And they certainly were in Italy, where imperialism and fascism for a long time promoted racism as, the right response to the challenging of society. So clearly many migrants carried with them those ideologies. On the other hand, of course, there were a lot of Italians who resisted that. So if you study the history of Italian migration around the world, that's also a history of anarchy. There is a history of resistance to Nazi fascists and so on. And you find already in the late 19th century, early 20th century, from socialist Italians, a very clear understanding of what's going on in Australia in terms of colonialism. So I don't think we can generalize. Clearly, as Ian was saying before, one of the role of diaspora within a capitalist colonial system is precisely to support the dispossession and exploitation of Indigenous land. So that is central to the whole experience, inevitably. But we also need to remember that a lot of people were in solidarity with indigenous people, and they had a different kind of political consciousness. So this is a very, very complex space. But certainly there were many Italians, probably the majority, who, you know, didn't even think about their role and complicity in settler colonialism.
Thanks, Francesco. And that complex to our next question, which comes from John Lane at the Academy Secretariat. Sophie, I think I'll throw to you first, but other panelists might like to have a go at this one as well. John's concerned that this work could reify and strengthen the action and change throughout Australia across all ethnic lines and others, presumably. Can the work go forward without assuming that that part of the answer of our knowledge is already known?
I don't really understand the question. So what part of our knowledge is being assumed?
I think John's asking about the assumption that we know everything about a white normative society, that we know everything we need to know about white settler history.
I understand. Yeah, that's a great question, John. I think writing about, you know, diversity in a society that's still deeply uncomfortable with diversity is hard. We are all still invested in pretty simplistic notions of our own ethnicity, you know, partly because for many of us, myself included, who come from an Anglo background, I get a lot of privilege because of that background. So I'll just answer, you know, in a kind of roundabout way. I have a wonderful student who's studying the history of smuggling in Sydney Harbour. She discovered that Governor Macquarie, someone that we associate with the history at the heart of kind of, I suppose, white settler society, he couldn't speak English till he was 16. He spoke Scots Gaelic. English was his second language. And I think that illustrates the point that I think you're making here, that there is a very, very complex, you know, history of dialects and ethnicities and religious difference and sectarian difference and class difference and gender difference that is part of so-called Anglo-Australian history. It's vital. What I think is that often we use that history politically, even in an everyday way, in a very simple way. We might refer to ourselves as Anglo or white, knowing that that doesn't capture anything of the complexity of our family story or what the lives of our ancestors might have been like. The reality is that there's still structural differences in our society that benefit me as a white person and make it harder for non-white people to live in this place. And I think that's why the histories of non-white Australia matter so much, because white histories get used to assert privilege. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't fund or support the histories of so-called Anglo-Australia. And I think the story of Lachlan Macquarie speaks to your point, that we haven't begun to understand the complexity of that history, of what it might mean for a 16-year-old man to learn English who speaks Scots Gaelic, you know, and become, you know, one of the most important symbols of kind of English-speaking society in the colony. So I think both should be supported, but we need to be attuned to the fact that an Anglo-centric view of this history still gets used politically to assert privilege.
Thanks, Sophie. Would any other of the panelists like to have a go at this one?
Just briefly, because I think Sophie is so good at answering very briefly and very effectively, so I don't have much to add, but I do think that there is still such an imbalance within history, and we just need to see history department, who gets ARC grants and so on. The imbalance is so apparent that nobody is saying that we don't need to study, of course, settler colonialism and consider, you know, Anglo-centric histories and perspectives, but you know, we also need to speak very clearly of the imbalance that exists and that needs to be addressed if we actually care about understanding something about this place. And otherwise, you know, it's just nationalistic rhetoric.
Thanks, Francesco. And I guess I would just add, John, from my perspective, my research on environmental relations across cultural differences is that a lot of the things we think we know because we've assumed white norms, we don't know at all, or we need to relearn, or we need to unlearn some of those norms. So these much more entangled histories and geographies are really important in part of that process. Now, I'm just going to pause before I go to some other questions. Do any of the panelists want to say anything about anything that's come to mind as the conversation's gone on that you'd like to jump in? Just wave your hand and I'll throw to
Can
you.
I ask Ruth a quick question?
Sure.
Ruth, I wanted to ask you a question about gender, and I wanted to ask you a question about knowledge in families. You've worked, really at the coalface of, I think, democracy, because really, what is more generative? What tells us more about community than the birth of a child, right? Nothing else really. So I wanted to ask you about the passing down of cultural knowledge in this country, and I wanted to ask you about the ways in which assimilation works. So do you feel like from what you've observed in your career that there is progress in terms of allowing women to give birth in diverse ways or not?
No, that's why I'm making a podcast, because I've been saying the same thing for so long, Sophie. Like I just kind of think health systems, like most of our institutions, are assimilatory. They're about imposing norms, and kind of they have this pedagogical kind of function and surveilling and disciplining function of populations. That's where biopolitics are writ large, and the job of health professionals is to surveil and discipline, unfortunately. And so even some ways in which families are nurtured and are loving, whether it's co-sleeping, which is controversial, whether it's kind of pampering the birthing parent for 40 days. They've been really quite controversial in my own research, where these cultural ways of doing things have been pathologized, seen as deviant and deficient, whether it's prenatally or postnatally, and just the idea that everyone should be this ideal neoliberal maternal subject that kind of gets back into being industrious as soon as possible, so I do despair, because I also think that one of the things about my profession is this incredible capacity for care that sort of tender-hearted people just get smashed in our systems that are highly accelerated and complex. And we need reflexive spaces. We need spaces of care and contemplation so that our health professionals can provide that for others. You can't provide what you don't receive yourself. So this is something that I feel strongly about. And in actual fact, if anyone's in Melbourne at the moment, we've got an exhibition that's launching tomorrow that's about nurses and midwives during the pandemic, but what happens, I think, in our systems is that that capacity to care and nurture and love, which is what parents need. I'm sure Francesco would agree with me, especially in those early days, is just so hard to make available. And so I kind of think, we abandon people when they really need us, and they need us for at least 20 years. So, but even in that first year, I think we could do much better. And so any kind of cultural ways of taking care, if they're pathologized, and then you encounter a system where you're othered, I just think it's a very, very difficult kind of situation to be in. And I know so many parents, especially First Nations parents, who I think get the brunt of this, especially, let alone people of color. who experienced just incredible structural violence in our systems that concerns me at a time when they're deeply vulnerable. So I think the rest of my life's work is about addressing that, and that might be within or without the academy, but I'm going to keep doing it anyway, because as you say, that's somewhere utterly profound where you can make a difference, Sophie. And if we can't do it there, where can we do it?
The midwives that spoke to me upon the birth of both my kids, I've literally never forgotten the words they said.
Yeah.
Ever.
It gets in, like the palm olive ad, it all gets in. You're so permeable, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think what the work you do is wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ruth and Sophie. Ian, I'm going to go back to a question you've already answered on the audience, and this is a question from Erin O'Donnell, who said, fantastic provocation, Ian. I love the idea of relocalizing. Do you think the recognition of rivers as living entities can be part of this process of reconnection with each other and with country?
Yes, I made an attempt to answer that by the chat function. And yes, absolutely. But the usual way that people think about that is an idea of legal recognition of rivers as living entities. Now, as you could imagine, my view of the Western legal system is quite dim. So what we need to do is personally feel the world is alive, that we're part of a living cosmos. Rivers are alive, obviously. Everything is alive, and we are simply part of that. So we can learn to feel that deeply. That's what we need. It's beyond recognition, and it's nothing to do with legal systems, but it's very, very.
I guess the question also, does legal recognition help us to feel, or does it help some of us to feel differently, or is it misguided effort to be put elsewhere?
Totally misguided.
Okay, thanks. All right. Oh, this has been such an interesting session. I'm feeling really moved by the whole thing, and so many threads to follow up. I'm just searching for any. Oh yes, we had a question about from Antonio Rubino. I'd like to ask the speakers whether they think that the university should make it a priority to pay a special attention to the training of researchers who can operate in different languages, as this is a requirement to access these untold stories. I presume the answer would be yes. Ruth's got a hand up.
Oh, I thought I'd take the initiative since we've got a few minutes left. I think it's not just language, but it's about being safe and culturally competent. Linda Tuhiwai-Smith a long time ago said, researchers can be extractive and theft, and it's a dirty word. And I think we need to pay attention to that, like whose interests are being served and why. Who benefits? Do communities and families benefit, or just the researcher? And I'm afraid our funding cycles, our structures, our systems really don't allow us to do research in ways that are careful and mana enhancing and dignity enhancing and respect enhancing. And so for me, it's like, of course, languages are great, being bilingual, multilingual, but fundamentally, it's a little bit like Yin's point before. We can do all these things around the edges, but unless we kind of actually address the way systems benefit people unevenly, even in academia, then I'm afraid we reinforce the kind of power relations that I feel I'm personally trying to escape.
Thanks, Ruth. That's a great kind of summing up comment, I think. So I think we're all going to go away and burn something down after this wonderful set of so it just remains for me to say thank you very much to the all the presenters, to our tech team, who are also kind of Ashley, particularly the events coordinator at the Academy, and encourage you all to have a look at our symposium in November. It's going to take place from the 17th and 18th of November in Ballarat. Just have a look at the Academy's website and you can see how to register. And of course, the recording of this session will be up on the YouTube channel within a couple of weeks. So thank you very much to our audience for your engaged questions. Thank you very much to everyone for joining us, and have a great afternoon.